Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is episode 27 of Bible Mechanics. And today I want to talk to you about scrolls and books. Now, the last two episodes have been about synagogues and churches, particularly ancient synagogues and churches. And today I'm going to talk about ancient scrolls and books. And I made the point, and I want to remind you that when I'm talking about ancient synagogues and churches, I'm talking about biblical times, which would run from roughly 1500 BC to about 100 AD, a period of about a millennium and a half, about 1500 years, 1600. And that's the time in which these synagogues and churches operated, and they operated as ways to convey the contents of written materials to a, generally speaking, non-literate public. So the leaders in a synagogue or church would read from Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, or one of the prophets, or one of the wisdom books like Psalms or Proverbs. The people would hear this, and that's how they came to know what was in those books. And their memories were better trained than ours are, and they were able to retain a lot of the content. They didn't have all the things that made it easy, just like people, kids today, I don't think they learn their multiplication tables, and because they've always got a calculator. And I haven't recited my multiplication tables in a long time. Probably can't do it anymore. Because rather than do math in my head, a lot of times I just reach for a calculator because it's on your phone or it's on your computer. It's just real easy to use devices that help you with these things. Well, the ancients didn't have any helpful devices like that, and so their memories became strong, just the way people used to be physically stronger, because they didn't have cars to take them places, and buses and planes and that sort of thing. So we talked about these synagogues and churches, and today I want to talk about the means by which the scriptures were read in these settings, and the main form that writings took were scrolls. Now, academics will sometimes call these rolls instead of scrolls. I don't know the difference. I'm just going to say scrolls. And they would unroll them. That's a good reason for calling them rolls. They would unroll them or unscroll them and read them horizontally. It was written usually on one side of the paper. And that wasn't really called paper back then. It was usually papyrus, which is made from a papyrus plant. And I think they'd last maybe 100 years before you had to copy them over. Of course, no printing press back then, so everything had to be, any copy you made had to be handwritten, just like the original was handwritten. And these scrolls were used to house these scriptures. Well, you know how big a Bible is. Well, scrolls, it would take lots and lots of scrolls to have the whole Old Testament put together. And it's not it was very expensive. It's not the kind of thing that regular people could afford. And even if they could afford it, it wouldn't have room to store them. They're not easy to carry around. So they would usually be stored wherever the meetings were held, whether it was in a home or some type of public place, and then eventually in dedicated buildings called synagogues. And that's how the written material was conveyed. And after the papyrus, they started using animal skins because they lasted longer. Those were called parchment instead of papyrus, and they would have a longer life. But basically, you had to stay on top of it. And the papyrus was very much affected by the climate you were in. If you were in a very dry climate, like in North Africa, where Egypt was located, the papyrus manuscripts would last a lot longer as opposed to, say, humid areas where moisture can affect them, and other climate conditions that I'm not scientific enough to appreciate. So that's why they still find a lot of these ancient manuscripts in Egypt. In fact, there's a place down there called Oxyrhynchus, I think, and in a trash dump hundreds of years ago, they found a lot of discarded manuscripts, and so they can last a very long time if they're in the right climate. So so that was how the Old Testament was read. When the New Testament was read, about that time, a new type of writing came into being called or a new form of it called a codex. And a codex, was mechanically very much like the modern book in that you stitched together or glued together leaves of papyrus writing. So you'd have pages, and they would be bound together, as I say, either stitched or glued, and then they could be read that way. And then that also made them very portable. You could take them around a lot easier. And so the books of the New Testament circulated a lot more quickly than did the Hebrew Scriptures. The Hebrew Scriptures generally kept on scrolls, generally kept initially at the temple, and then when the temple was destroyed in 586 by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and the Jews were dispersed throughout the world, those scrolls a lot of times would be copied in these other places, but they couldn't, because of the reasons I gave, they couldn't be easily copied and carried around. So the codex really changed things, and the codex eventually was eventually called a book. Now, the irony here is that at the time all the Bible texts, the original 66 texts, were written, whether Old Testament, 39 of them, and the New Testament, 27, when they were all written, there was no such thing as the book as we know it. There was not even, the codex was just barely coming into being. It came into use late in the first century. And of course, all the New Testament, most of the New Testament writings, if not all of them, were written before the end. Well, they have all been written before the end of the first century. And most of them written before late in the first century. So the irony is that you'll find the word book in both testaments, but books as we know it did not exist. For people back then, the word book meant a record, a scroll, a document. And so I could wish that the English translators wouldn't use the book in there, because it creates an anachronism in readers' minds. They simply mean that they're trying to use a word that people today would understand. And so it served the function of a book, so they called it a book. But you and I are better served if we remember that books as such, like we're used to, didn't exist during that time. And, the copies, the codexes that I said circulated, probably beginning late in the first century, but certainly by the second century, when they were making copies of the apostles' writings to send them around everywhere, they would send them in collections, like the four Gospels would usually go out in a collection, and Paul's epistles would go out all together. Those were probably the two most common collections. You could call them sub-collections, since these sub-collections came together in the New Testament. Okay, so now, in appreciating the mechanics of how the Bible that we have came to be, we now recognize that, okay, they're originally written in scroll form, and that most people couldn't read, and so you had to gather people together. You had to get an assembly, a congregation that you can read it to, and that's how people knew what was in the documents. And that about the end of that period of time, when all these documents were written, this book form developed, and then eventually we get our book Bibles. So that's scrolls and books to go with the synagogues and churches we've been talking about. Hope that's helpful. See you next time.